What would you do if a family vacation revealed that everything you thought you knew about your spouse was a carefully constructed lie? We often imagine betrayal as loud, explosive arguments, doors slamming, confessions screamed in desperation. But real betrayal? It can be quiet. It can sit silently across the dinner table, smile in family photos, hold your child's hand. Sometimes it looks like love. In the summer of 2018, Daniel Ruiz thought he was giving his young family the break they needed. A surprise invitation to a luxury cabin in Lake Tahoe seemed like a generous offer from his wealthy uncle, a chance to unwind, reconnect, and make memories. But beneath the surface of the pristine lake and the picture-perfect vacation, something older, darker, and far more dangerous had been waiting to surface. What began as a peaceful getaway would end with a broken family, a body at the bottom of a cliff, and a husband questioning everything he ever believed about his wife and about himself. Daniel Ruiz was, by most standards, a good man, a 34-year-old software engineer who believed in systems, schedules, and logic. He lived a life of discipline. Reserved in manner, soft-spoken, and unfailingly polite, Daniel was the kind of person who held doors open, remembered birthdays, and always came home in time for dinner, unless work absolutely demanded otherwise. He wasn't one for confrontation or drama. He valued stability and truth, especially within the family unit. After 5 years of marriage and the birth of their son, Daniel still viewed Tara through the lens of trust and admiration. He loved her calm confidence, the way she carried herself, and the grace with which she mothered their child. If anything seemed off, he dismissed it. After all, love meant believing, even when you didn't fully understand. Tara Ruiz was elegance wrapped in restraint. In her previous life, she'd worked as an event hostess. At least that's what she'd told Daniel. The details were always vague. High-end venues, short-term contracts, international clients. When they met, she spoke of those years with breezy detachment, quickly pivoting to how she wanted to settle down, build a family, find peace. Now in her early 30s, she was a devoted stay-at-home mom with a refined taste in wine, clothing, and furniture. Her days revolved around their toddler, healthy cooking, and keeping their home spotless. On the surface, Tara was the model wife, graceful, attentive, grounded. But there were subtle inconsistencies, moments of pause when her past came up, and a nervous energy that flickered through her eyes when the topic drifted too close to certain names or timelines. Martin Delgado, Daniel's uncle, was a presence that filled a room. In his late 50s, Martin had no wife, no children, and seemingly no worries. A self-described investor, he lived off passive income from properties and offshore accounts, though no one in the family really knew the full scope of his business. He was charming, generous, always ready to pay for dinner, offer a loan, or gift something lavish on birthdays. But beneath that warmth was an unsettling familiarity, a tendency to hug a second too long, to make jokes that hovered on the edge of impropriety. He was the kind of relative everyone smiled around, but secretly avoided one-on-one. Still, his financial power gave him influence, and few dared to question his motives. The invitation came unexpectedly, during a particularly hectic week. Daniel was buried in deadlines when Tara walked into his home office holding her phone, a strange smile on her face. "Guess who just called?" she said. Martin. He was offering them a week-long stay at his brand-new property in Lake Tahoe, a fully stocked cabin with panoramic lake views, a private dock, and a chef who came every other day. It was a gift, he said, something for the young family to enjoy, a way to reconnect and recharge. Daniel was hesitant. His work schedule was tight, and he wasn't one to drop everything for last-minute trips. He liked planning. He liked knowing what to expect. But Tara was unusually insistent. She pushed gently, using their son as the emotional lever. "He's never seen a lake like that. It'll be magical," she said. "You've been working so hard, we deserve this." There was something in her eyes, a glimmer of excitement, or was it anxiety, that Daniel couldn't quite read. But he relented. Maybe it would be good for all of them. Martin's enthusiasm was palpable when they confirmed. "I'll make sure everything's perfect," he said. "Family deserves the best." He emphasized the word family like it meant something more, something heavier. Daniel noticed it, but brushed it off. Martin was always theatrical. The drive up to Tahoe was long but scenic. As they pulled into the driveway, the cabin came into view. Sleek glass panels reflecting the lake, natural wood accents, an architectural marvel nestled in the trees. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and expensive cologne. High-end furnishings, a wine cellar stocked with vintages Daniel couldn't pronounce, a kitchen better equipped than most restaurants. It was more than a vacation home. It was indulgence, materialized. That first evening, everything looked idyllic. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Martin poured wine like a practiced sommelier, and a chef served them grilled salmon and truffle risotto. They posed for photos by the lake, their son giggling as he chased dragonflies. From the outside, it was the kind of evening people post online, filtered, flawless, enviable. But something was off. Tara, usually warm and present, seemed distracted. She laughed when appropriate, smiled on cue, but there was a tightness in her jaw and a glassiness in her eyes that Daniel hadn't seen before. She excused herself early, saying the baby needed to sleep, though he had already dozed off in Daniel's arms. And Martin was too attentive. He watched Tara with a closeness that didn't feel like familial concern. His compliments, while subtle, carried an undercurrent that made Daniel shift uncomfortably in his seat. Still, Daniel told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he was jealous. Though of what? He wasn't sure. The fire crackled louder as the night stretched on. Somewhere between the clinking of wine glasses and Martin's laughter, the first hairline fracture appeared in what Daniel thought was a perfect life. The second morning began with the illusion of peace. Sunlight poured through the tall glass walls, casting fractured reflections across polished wood floors. The lake outside was still, glassy and perfect, as if trying to mimic the calm Daniel wanted to believe in. In the kitchen, Martin moved with ease, orchestrating breakfast like he belonged there. He set mugs down at the counter, plating pancakes with confident flair. Tara sat silently, her posture graceful, eyes distant. Daniel entered, rubbing sleep from his eyes, grateful for the smell of coffee. He reached for his usual mug but paused when he noticed Tara already sipping from hers. Martin, without being asked, had handed it to her, prepared just right. No cream, 2 sugars. Daniel blinked. That was a preference she had never verbalized in front of Martin, not even once. Yet he had known. There was a remark. Casual, almost. Careless, about how a certain dress brought out her eyes. Daniel didn't remember her wearing it before. He didn't remember Martin ever seeing it. But the comment hung in the air, like the faint scent of something burning. Tara smiled quickly, but her fingers curled slightly tighter around the porcelain, and the moment passed without acknowledgement. That morning, conversation was light, but the silences were heavier. As the day wore on, those silences became louder than words. Down by the lake, they lounged on the deck under a hazy blue sky. Tara sat with the toddler in her lap, while Martin poured wine, positioning himself in the chair nearest to hers. Each movement he made toward her was just within the boundaries of politeness. Yet there was a fluency to the way he addressed her, a rhythm of old familiarity that made Daniel feel like an outsider in his own marriage. There was another comment, barely audible, about her perfume, something about how it hadn't changed. Daniel had always believed she wore that scent for him, but now it smelled like a memory he hadn't been part of. The look Tara gave in response wasn't one of gratitude. It was restraint, the kind used to manage a situation without drawing attention. By evening, the house had grown warmer with the aroma of garlic and herbs. Tara and Martin moved easily through the kitchen while Daniel watched. They cooked without instruction, anticipating one another's steps like two people who had done this before. It was unsettling, the way they passed utensils, how she instinctively reached for the same bottle of wine he uncorked, the way they laughed too quickly at shared references Daniel couldn't place. There was a mention of a bistro in San Diego. Tara nodded, smile tight. Daniel couldn't remember a trip to San Diego. He couldn't remember her ever speaking of one. When he asked about it, her response was vague, deflective. The subject changed quickly, and yet the details kept slipping through. The wine, Martin. Joe's the familiarity in his tone when speaking about Tara's taste in food, her supposed eye for quality. Daniel wasn't a suspicious man by nature, but that night, as he put their son to sleep and sat quietly beside the crib, he felt the unmistakable ache of uncertainty begin to settle into his chest. For reassurance, he opened the baby monitor app on his phone. The system had been updated recently and allowed for audio pickup in surrounding rooms. He had activated it out of habit, just another layer of precaution, a simple measure to ensure their son's safety. He hadn't meant to leave it running. Back in the living room, Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone when the audio feed buzzed faintly. He leaned in. At first there was just white noise, then muffled voices. Not from the nursery, another room, a guest room. Martin's voice carried low and firm, unmistakable. The words weren't loud, but their weight was crushing, phrases layered with memory and entitlement. Something about how she used to call him Daddy. A cruel reminder of a dynamic that was never supposed to exist. Daniel didn't move. His breath caught in his throat. He adjusted the volume. The conversation continued, revealing more than he wanted to hear. There were references to money, clothing, years of protection, jobs. That never existed. Daniel listened, heart pounding as Martin spelled out a past laced with control and compliance. Not love, not passion, power. Tara's voice emerged, quiet, strained. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't shocked. She was negotiating. It became clear this wasn't a rekindling of an old affair. It had never ended. At best, it had been dormant, waiting. At worst, it had evolved into something uglier. Tara spoke with urgency, desperation. She didn't protest what Martin was demanding. Instead, she tried to contain it, to shield her husband, to protect her child. Daniel sat perfectly still, phone in hand, as the recording ended. He stayed there long after the house fell into silence. Hours passed, but he couldn't bring himself to move. He replayed the audio again and again, each time catching a nuance he'd missed. A shift in tone, a pause too long, a phrase that rewrote entire years of his marriage. The truth arrived, not in one violent wave, but in hundreds of small, sharp realizations. Her clothing, the unexplained gifts, the house they lived in. The way Martin always lingered at family gatherings, Tara's avoidance of questions about her past, the wedding gift from Martin that was too generous to be casual, the photo Daniel had once found and dismissed, Tara smiling, standing beside Martin, before she ever knew Daniel. Or so he had believed. His marriage had been a structure built on secrets, carefully placed, delicately maintained, and now beginning to crumble. As the first hint of dawn tinted the lake silver, Daniel saved the recording under a file name he wouldn't forget. He backed it up to the cloud. The evidence now existed outside of him. It was real. It had happened. The only thing left was to decide what to do next. Confront Tara, challenge Martin, or simply leave. He looked down the hallway where his wife slept beside their child and realized there was no version of this that would end gently. Morning was coming, and with it, a reckoning. Morning arrived with a deceptive calm. Sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, soft and golden, casting warmth across the hardwood floors. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of another beautiful day by the lake. Inside, everything had changed, at least for Daniel. He moved through the early routines with quiet precision, careful not to betray the storm within him. He dressed their toddler with gentle hands, made breakfast with a steady rhythm, and even kissed Tara on the forehead. His tone was light, his expression neutral. Every gesture was calculated, a performance meant to keep suspicion at bay until he decided what came next. Tara's movements were different. She kept herself busy, too busy, wiping clean surfaces that didn't need cleaning, arranging and rearranging items on the counter with obsessive focus. Her eyes never stayed on Daniel's for more than a second. She smiled when she had to, but it never reached her eyes. Guilt hung over her like fog. Martin behaved like nothing was wrong. He joined them for breakfast wearing a fresh linen shirt, hair neatly combed, the very picture of composed hospitality. He spoke of the weather and a nearby trail he wanted to explore, sipping his coffee with the same ease as if he hadn't just shattered another man's life the night before. He barely looked at Tara, but the silence between them was telling. Stiff, overly formal, strained in a way Daniel couldn't unsee anymore. By mid-morning, Daniel suggested taking the toddler for a walk down to the park near the lake trailhead. Tara agreed too quickly, almost relieved. She remained behind, claiming she wanted to catch up on laundry. Her eyes flicked toward Martin once, then quickly away. At the park, Daniel stood behind the stroller for longer than necessary. His mind raced. He replayed the recording again in his head, not the words, but the weight of them. He wasn't sure what outcome he was walking toward, only that he couldn't allow things to remain as they were. There were truths that demanded confrontation, and whatever followed, he would no longer be passive. He returned to the cabin an hour later with the child asleep in his arms. Inside, everything was still. Tara was upstairs, rocking in the nursery chair. Martin had gone out back to the fire pit near the edge of the wooded bluff. It was the perfect moment. Daniel set the baby down gently, tucked beneath a blanket in the crib. He moved silently through the house, past the kitchen, through the sliding glass doors, and into the pine-scented morning air. The lake sparkled in the distance, wind stirring the trees, the fire pit cold and unused. Martin stood with his back turned, watching the lake. He didn't hear Daniel approach. From a distance, it might have looked like two men having a quiet talk, casual, familial. But something in Daniel's posture betrayed the truth. He stood stiff, hands at his sides, jaw tight. The silence stretched. Martin eventually turned, noticing him, offering a brief nod. What passed between them in that moment wasn't spoken. No words were needed to name what both already knew. Martin's face shifted subtly, something between recognition and caution. The easy smile he wore at breakfast didn't return. The two men stood for a while longer, as if trying to outlast each other in stillness. But the tension coiled tighter. Daniel's breathing was shallow, his hands clenched and unclenched, not from fear, but from fury contained too long. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about everything that had been taken from him without his knowledge. The years of quiet manipulation, the erosion of something sacred. It was about his wife, his child, his life. Martin shifted. His weight, saying something Daniel barely registered. A gesture, a half-shrug, an attempt to maintain control. It didn't work. The mask had slipped, and then it happened. There was no plan, no rehearsed lines, just a sudden break. The dam gave way. Daniel lunged, not with rage, but with a cold, deliberate purpose. His hands went to Martin's shirt, dragging him forward. The older man staggered, caught off guard. He tried to push back, but the slope beneath them was uneven, loose gravel underfoot. They struggled, awkwardly, violently, near the bluff's edge. No one screamed. There was no dramatic fall, no cinematic moment. Just a flurry of movement, a scuffle, a slip, and then silence. Martin was gone. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the empty space where seconds earlier a man had been. His chest heaved, not from exertion, but from disbelief. The air was still. Below, the cliff, the trees moved gently, hiding everything. Time stilled. He took a step back, heart pounding. The magnitude of what had just happened wasn't immediate. It sank in slowly, like a rising tide. Then came the reflexes. He scanned the area. No one had followed. No one had seen. The fire pit remained untouched. The trees stood witness, but they would not speak. Back at the cabin, Daniel moved quickly, methodically. He washed his hands in the outdoor sink, changed his shirt, and placed the soiled one at the bottom of the laundry hamper. Outside, he returned to the fire pit. He adjusted the chair Martin had been sitting in, smoothed the gravel, picked up a discarded cigarette butt and tossed it into the embers. Every trace of struggle had to disappear. Inside, the house was quiet. Tara was still in the nursery, the baby sleeping soundly. She asked where Martin had gone. Daniel told her. He'd gone out for a walk down to the lake. Alone. She didn't ask again. By noon, Martin Delgado had vanished. No alarm was raised, no suspicions voiced. But beneath the polished surface of that luxury cabin, something had been shattered beyond repair. And Daniel Ruiz, once quiet, methodical, trusting, was no longer the man who had arrived just 2 days earlier. The body was discovered late that afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent over Lake Tahoe, casting long shadows through the trees when Tara began to grow uneasy. Martin hadn't returned from his supposed walk, and the atmosphere inside, the cabin had turned heavy, stifled by a quiet that no one acknowledged. She waited another hour, then stepped outside and called for him, at first lightly, then louder, her voice cutting through the trees. Daniel stood on the porch, silent, watching her. It was a hiker who found him. Several 100 feet down the slope near a rocky outcrop, Martin's body lay crumpled among pine needles and shattered stone. Emergency responders arrived within the hour. Local sheriff, a pair of paramedics, and a park ranger. The call was logged as a possible accident. An elderly man, hiking alone, perhaps intoxicated, had lost his footing. The fall was substantial and the terrain uneven. It didn't seem unusual. Tragic, yes, but not suspicious. Tara gave a statement to the deputy, her voice steady but tinged with panic. She explained that Martin had gone out mid-morning and hadn't returned. Daniel added that he had been out, with their toddler at the park. Both expressed concern, then shock, then quiet grief. Their behavior fit the moment. Helpful, emotional, disoriented. No one questioned them, yet. The sheriff made notes. There were no immediate signs of foul play. No weapon, no visible blood trail, no witnesses. The scene matched the narrative. A man walking near the edge, perhaps dizzy, perhaps distracted and then gone. An autopsy was scheduled as a formality, but within days the case would shift from routine to something far more complex. The medical. Examiner's report began with the expected. Death caused by blunt force trauma, consistent with a high fall. But the secondary details altered everything. There were contusions around the neck, bruising in the shape of hands. The bruises were not consistent with post-fall impact. Instead, they indicated pressure, deliberate, focused, forceful. The coroner noted the presence of defensive wounds on Martin's forearms, skin beneath his nails, and micro-abrasions on his palms, suggesting he had struggled. More critically, the neck trauma had occurred before the fall. He had been strangled, partially, at least prior to tumbling down the cliff, and though the injuries from the fall were fatal, the strangulation could not be ignored. With that, the case turned. The accidental death was reclassified as a suspicious homicide. The sheriff returned to the cabin, this time with more officers. Daniel and Tara were asked to sit for formal interviews, separately. Daniel, as expected, remained calm. He answered every question clearly, offering timestamps and details that matched his original account. He described the morning at the park, naming the cafe he stopped at for coffee, listing the approximate time he returned to the cabin. He emphasized how little he had seen of Martin that day. His tone was flat, cooperative, and appropriately somber. He was the image of a grieving nephew, logical, consistent. Tara's responses were more emotional. She cried during the interview, held a tissue to her face, and spoke of Martin as family. Her timeline matched Daniel's, but she was overly specific about the moment she had been asleep or occupied with the baby, as if preempting suspicion. When asked about Martin's behavior during the trip, she hesitated. Her description of their relationship before Daniel was vague. Mentions of family gatherings, mentorship, financial help when she was struggling. But the interviewer sensed something rehearsed beneath the surface. The second shift came with digital evidence. A routine scan of the cabin's Wi-Fi network led to the discovery of an inactive baby monitor with storage capability. Investigators noticed that the system had been paired with Daniel's phone. A forensic sweep followed. Deleted files were recovered from Daniel's cloud backup. Audio clips timestamped the night before Martin's death. Technicians filtered through the data. They found it. Voices, a man's and a woman's. The conversation was low, but clear. Enough. Key phrases stood out. Terms of control, past transactions, veiled threats, and desperation. The tone alone was alarming. One line stood out above all. "I didn't bring your little family here out of kindness." The recording alone wasn't enough to prove murder, but it shattered the original story of a peaceful vacation. Phone GPS records added pressure. Daniel's movements on the day of Martin's death aligned with his park visit, but there was a gap. A 40-minute window where location data froze. Investigators flagged it. Meanwhile, a search of Daniel's phone revealed deleted call logs and message drafts. Nothing concrete, no confession, but enough to warrant further probing. Back at the sheriff's office, prints taken from the railing near the fire pit matched Daniel's. The same railing where the struggle might have occurred. Soil samples from his shoes contained mineral traces consistent with the cliffside terrain, but not from the trail below. Tara's phone showed nothing, but the financial investigation into Martin's estate did. For years, Martin had been sending money to Tara, irregular payments often disguised as consulting fees or personal loans. One dated back nearly a decade. It predated her marriage. Others continued through the early years of her relationship with Daniel. One deposit aligned precisely with their home's down payment. When presented with the evidence, Tara didn't resist long. She broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a slow, unraveling sadness. She admitted the truth, that she and Martin had a relationship before she met Daniel, that it hadn't fully ended, that it was complicated, transactional, controlling. She said she had tried to break free, but Martin had always found a way to return, through guilt, through money, through threats, Daniel confessed shortly after. He spoke not in anger, but in exhaustion. He acknowledged the confrontation. He described the tension, the insult, the final push. He said it hadn't been planned, that he hadn't meant for it to go that far, that everything he did afterward was panic, not malice. The sheriff listened. The prosecution built a case. But the complexity of motive became clear. This wasn't about greed or revenge. It was about protection, about fear, about a man who had spent years manipulating a woman under the guise of generosity and the quiet devastation that followed. The legal team prepared for trial. The defense positioned Daniel not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man who had reached a breaking point. They cited emotional disturbance, heat of passion, trauma, and underneath it all the question remained, how do you prosecute someone for reacting to something no one should have to endure? The truth was out. But justice, like everything else in this story, would be far more complicated. The courtroom held a weight that words couldn't carry. It was the kind of silence that settled not just in the walls, but inside the people seated on the benches, family, jurors, former neighbors, observers. Faces leaned forward, searching for something more than truth, perhaps clarity, perhaps validation. But what this case offered instead was discomfort, because no one could decide what Daniel Ruiz truly was, a protector or a killer. The trial began on a grey morning nearly 10 months after Martin Delgado's body was found at the base of a wooded cliff near Lake Tahoe. By then, every fact had been examined, every file dissected. But it wasn't the evidence that held people's attention, it was the story. A devoted husband, a secret relationship, a wealthy uncle with a past no one questioned until it was too late. The prosecution opened with a clear stance. Daniel Ruiz had taken justice into his own hands. They framed the killing as premeditated, citing Daniel's calm demeanor, the cover-up, and the lack of immediate confession. According to them, this was not a man pushed to the edge, but one who made a cold decision to eliminate a man who threatened the image of his family. The defense saw things differently. They painted Daniel not as a criminal, but as a man who had been handed a devastating truth in the most intimate of ways. A man who, after discovering the long-term manipulation of his wife and the ongoing threat to his family, snapped. Not with cruelty, but with instinct. Not to avenge his pride, but to protect the people he loved. Jury selection was meticulous. Each candidate was asked not just about their views on violence and self-defense, but about family, betrayal, and control. Eventually, 12 were chosen, a mix of parents, professionals, and retirees, the kind of people who knew what it meant to protect something and what it meant to lose it. The courtroom filled as evidence was presented. The baby monitor audio was played first. The recording was muffled, but the implication was clear. Phrases like "you owe me" and "I didn't bring your little family here out of kindness" were enough to silence the room. The jury listened without expression, though a few stole glances at Tara, seated quietly behind the defense table. The medical examiner testified next. He confirmed the cause of death, blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, but noted the bruising on Martin's neck, finger-shaped marks applied with significant pressure. He explained that the injuries occurred before the fall, suggesting a struggle. That detail alone shifted the tone of the trial. It was no longer a question of whether Martin fell, but how and why. Financial records followed, bank transfers from Martin to Tara spanning nearly a decade. Labeled as consulting, gifts, or loans, they painted a pattern of financial dependence. The prosecution argued this didn't justify violence. The defense argued it revealed coercion. Character witnesses for Daniel testified next. Friends and co-workers described him as calm, rational, deeply devoted to his family, a man who avoided confrontation and had never shown signs of aggression. The contrast between who he had been and what he had done became the trial's core tension. Then Tara took the stand. Her voice shook at first, but she spoke clearly. She admitted to a relationship with Martin that had begun when she was much younger, financial, emotional, exploitative. She explained how even after she married Daniel, Martin continued to exert control through money and guilt. She said she hadn't told Daniel the truth because she was ashamed and afraid. That Martin had promised to stop, until he didn't. That the Lake Tahoe trip was the final trap. When asked about the confrontation, she said she hadn't known it was going to happen, that she had been upstairs, trying to protect her child, unaware of the argument unfolding near the fire pit. But that when Martin didn't return, part of her knew. Daniel also testified. He described the moment he heard the recording, how it unraveled everything he thought he understood about his wife, his uncle, and his family. He didn't justify the act. He didn't deny the violence, but he explained the emotional collapse, the disbelief, the helplessness, the rage. He said he had felt cornered, deceived, and terrified that the man who had once helped them buy a home was now using that same leverage to destroy them. Psychologists were called in. One spoke of trauma responses, the way sudden emotional devastation can override rational judgment. Another explained patterns of financial abuse, how manipulation through money can be just as damaging as physical violence. The jury listened, absorbing the language of cycles and control, and how both men, Martin and Daniel, had held power at different times in different ways. Closing statements offered no simple answers. The prosecution maintained that justice couldn't be emotional. The defense argued that no jury should punish a man for protecting his family when no one else would. Deliberation took 2 days. When the jury returned, the room held its breath. Daniel Ruiz was found guilty, not of murder, but of voluntary manslaughter. The court acknowledged the killing had occurred, but also that it had been driven by extreme emotional disturbance. The verdict offered both punishment and understanding. At sentencing, the judge addressed the room solemnly. He recognized the tragedy on all sides. A life had been taken, a family broken, and a community left asking difficult questions. But he also acknowledged Daniel's remorse, Tara's vulnerability, and the context of coercion that had shaped the entire case. Daniel was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 8. Tara didn't cry when the sentence was read. She sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Daniel turned once to look at her as he was led away, but she didn't meet his gaze. In the months that followed, Tara sold the family home. The Lake Tahoe property was placed back on the market, stripped of its furnishings and reputation. She moved closer to her sister, raising her child away from the stares and whispers. Money was tight. Therapy became routine. Conversations about the past were delayed until her son was old enough to ask questions. But the weight of the truth never really left. Daniel adjusted to life behind bars with the same quiet discipline he had shown as a software engineer. He worked, read, and kept to himself. Letters from Tara came once a month, brief updates about their son, milestones missed, small drawings folded into envelopes. The case raised questions that could never be fully answered. Who do we protect when the cost of silence becomes unbearable? How long can truth stay buried before it explodes?